now, I'd probably put a little footnote in, and Pidge of Davidson Presbyterian made this wonderful remark. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I guess we have a few more minutes until we actually get started, and Megan is going to be the person to let us know. And without saying anything about where I'm going to go, I will just point out how current these questions are, because if you take the Observer, then there will be a story today, and in which a measure of collusion, a measure of cover-up is alleged at the university, which is my beloved university where I work, around the handling of complaints made by young women against a lecturer in the history department. And so if you read that, it will resonate. Let me just say that, because as I said last week, and I'm going to say it really again and again, if we can't name what we see in our own texts, we won't be able to name it and see it when it's all around us, which it is. Yeah. So Megan, tell me when we get started officially, and then I'll begin with all of you.
Perfect. I think we'll plan to go at about 9:45.
Okay.
Because we're seeing people trickle into the YouTube feed.
Okay. In that case, any other snarky or funny moments in addition to Pidge's? Because actually, Pidge, that whole thing about getting fleeced is sort of a theme in Genesis, like whose kid gets used for what, right? And if you remember Esau, like wearing a goat skin in order to fool his father. And you might remember that Jacob's sons dipped Joseph's cloak in the blood of, a goat in order to fool their father. So people getting fleeced in the way we understand that word, using that particular animal again and again. Yeah. Sort of what goes around keeps coming around, same time.
Well, and there's so many references for it's all about the money. Everybody's looking at the money in a very selfish way. The inheritance, and everybody's really, I felt like the whole first part of the story was who's going to get what, and he can't have my inheritance, and if he doesn't live, I get his.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is, whether you get 25% of what your father's wealth has managed to produce, or whether you get 2/3 of it, is a really, really significant difference. Absolutely. So, yeah, that's also something we should know from our own time. Who's going to get the money, and how are they going to get the money, and who's going to get paid off, and, what will be the fee for various kinds of fixing that goes on in our society all the time. Absolutely. I'm glad you went back and were thinking so closely about this. That's just wonderful work. Did the rest of you get a chance to go back and look at Genesis 38 again? Yes.
What I find interesting is the bloodlines and bringing in Canaanites and different, and of course, what we know from genetics now is that actually probably strengthened the race, because there would be less intermarriage. But it's very interesting as you go through the Bible, the number of matches, should we say, from outside the Jewish race.
So I would say two things about that, Eric. And one is, I'd be a little hesitant to use the word race in this context, but in terms of people and tribe, yeah. Also, a lot of that intermarriage is going on among Semitic tribes. And thirdly, of course, we need to remember that maybe or maybe not, Bible is actually telling us a historical story, right? Like, we'd have no proof that there was such a character as Jacob or Abraham or even Moses. The first time we have historical evidence of any character in Hebrew Bible is, and it's still a perhaps, is David, is King David. So a lot of this may be legendary material. And yet, this other question about how how this little family group becomes a tribe, becomes a nation, right? There are stages in that, and the integration of other peoples is part of that story, right? So yeah.
We are
Are we ready, Megan?
we are at 9:45. So
Okay.
I think we're good to get started. So welcome and thank you for joining the class. And I'll turn it over to you, Barbara.
Thank you. So this is not a shameless plug. This is now a warning. I'm going to put the link to the current book, which is being published by Routledge, into chat. And the reason that I'm putting that there is because I want you to understand what it is that this research has been about. The words malignant fraternities kind of give you a thing to hang your understanding on in terms of what is it that I'm looking at. I'm looking at malignant fraternities. I'm looking at things that are dangerous. Now, I actually did not choose some of the most painful topics that are covered in that book. They include, for example, the gang rape of the Levite's concubine and the rape of Tamar, David's daughter. Deliberately, because I thought those are they're extremely painful texts. So am I choosing painful text? Yes, because the whole book is full of painful texts. But am I choosing the most painful text? Maybe not. Nevertheless, I want to make clear that I made a terrible mistake last week. And I want to do, as we would say, teshuva for it, ask your forgiveness. And that was that I did not say to you, listen, it's quite possible that the material that I'm covering could trigger all sorts of things in you. And that might be memories of abuse you yourselves have experienced, memories of abuse you heard about from friends or other members of the family, or experiences you may have had even as heterosexual men among men in terms of how men might have been interacting with women, either in youth or in present time, right? So all of this could potentially be quite triggering, this material. And so I want to say right now, if that happens and you feel triggered by the material that I'm presenting with you today and next Sunday, then I ask you to take care of yourself. And that might mean leaving the group, right? And connecting with me later and talking through whatever might have happened, or talking through whatever might have happened with your own spiritual leaders at the church. Okay, so is everybody like clear on that? Yeah, all right, thank you. And I hope you will accept my apology for not making that warning. It's a warning I routinely do on all my syllabi in academic classes, and I don't know why I didn't think to do that with you, and I should have. We've known each other a very, very long time, and I should have remembered to be careful to help protect you. Because, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, in any group I walk into, I can statistically expect a certain number of the women in that room to have been the victims of some kind of sexual harassment or sexual violence, and probably the number in my head is understated. And I can pretty much expect that a goodly number of the men in the room know something about that, either from the women that they have married, the daughters that they have had, the nieces, the sisters, the mothers, all those things. Okay, so I'm going to share a screen and I'm going to go through kind of an extended PowerPoint about Genesis 38, and then I'm going to open that up to our questions. And I'm going to start that PowerPoint by reminding you that if any point during the PowerPoint you want clarification, that you please, in fact, ask me for that. Interrupt me. Do not at all hesitate to ask me to go over something a second time. Okay, so now I'm going to get us all the way back to where we should be, which is actually here. And let me, for some reason, I have all sorts of things on my screen. Let's try to clean that up a little bit. And there we go. Okay, so this time, what we're going to be looking at is these particular elements that are the sort of groundwork for the work that I just finished: hegemonic masculinity, male homosociality, and friendship. And I'm going to just briefly remind you of the kinds of things that I said last week, and for those who might not have been able to make last week but are here now, what hegemonic masculinity is, right? This is a cultural idea of masculine performance. It's sort of a dominant idea of what masculinity looks like. The way in which male homosociality maintains hegemonic masculinity and what its features include, right? There's emotional detachment frequently, and friendship supported by and often sexual experience, sometimes experiencing war. That's another way in which homosociality gets expressed. There's a lot of competitiveness, that we have a constant renegotiation of rank, and the sexual objectification of women, both past and present features of male homosociality. So then I also spoke to you a little bit about, what is friendship and who are friends, that we have features of friendship that show up in Hebrew Bible. In fact, there's a whole book written just on friendship in Hebrew Bible by Saul Olyan, a very well-known scholar. It's actually called Friendship in the Hebrew Bible. And he describes many of these features around sharing danger, remaining loyal. This last piece, expressing affection and love in both fraternal and conjugal terms, comes up a lot, by the way, in the story of David and Jonathan, sort of expressing love as a brotherhood thing or even as a marital thing. And those of you who might have read the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu might remember that when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh mourns for his friend as a widow, acts like a widow. So language that is conjugal or fraternal can sometimes be the language in Hebrew Bible that is used to describe friendship. So what do we know at the outset? This is a bit of a review of where we started last week. And I mentioned to you this use of the term vayet, that Judah leaves his father and brothers and turns to Hira. And in the very next verse, he sees a woman, and the Hebrew is super explicit here. He sees a woman there. So the Hebrew very specifically connects this woman to Hira, that this is Hira's neighborhood, and that's where Judah sees the woman. And then, as I told you last week, we get a sequential, very graphic description of sexual act. He takes her, and there's a pregnancy and a child. He takes her, there's a pregnancy and a child. He takes her, and there's a pregnancy and a child. And the language in Hebrew is literally, he goes into her, right? That is how that act is described. It's important here to know that Hira is likely functioning in a role that we see in the Hebrew Bible called the king's friend. Now, obviously, Judah is not a king, but he stands in the narrative as the ancestor of the kingly line, right? He is, in a manner, the father of kings. And the things that he carries with him, which I'll talk about later, the seal, the staff, and the cord, are all understood to have associations with kingly items, right? That you have a scepter. Remember in the story of Esther, there's a really graphic use of Ahasuerus' scepter, because he has to actually extend it to her to touch in order to save her life. We'll get more into what these scepters actually also can stand for, but they certainly stand for also royal power. Hira's work as a best man figure. The best man figure has certain kinds of roles around marriage, around finding a woman for a man, around functioning as having these kinds of responsibilities. And so a much older scholar who was operating in the middle of the last century wrote an article where he was describing all the king's friends in the Hebrew Bible. And he says, Hira has this kind of function. And Hira may most likely have even arranged the marriage between Judah and Bashua. The fact that the text says that Judah finds her in Hira's neighborhood is, for Van Selms and for me, salient. He doesn't go anywhere else. He doesn't travel outside. Bashua is right there in that region. So what do we know about Tamar? Again, the Hebrew is very interesting here because it literally is several verses in a row, starting on verse 2, where it first says Judah takes this woman Bashua and goes into her. And this happens sequentially in such a level that by verse 6, right after all of these pregnancies and children are announced, the very next thing that you read is that Judah takes another woman. Now, in your translations, it will probably say in verse 6, Judah got a wife for his firstborn son, right? Something like that. But the Hebrew there is actually Judah took a woman, which, if you stopped it right there, is sort of like weirdly then potentially reads in the Hebrew as kind of an echo of what he's already just done for himself. So I just kind of want to put that there, right? You know, there's a lot of sexual innuendo in Hebrew Bible that gets missed in translation. These are earthy writers, much more earthy than you could possibly imagine from our translations. And as you know, right after Er's death, Judah insists that Onan, Sarah's son, and his brother's name to complete the leveret. He repeatedly has sex with her and spills his seed. And that Judah then makes the decision neither to marry Tamar to his third son, nor to release her from any obligation, and sends her to her father. Now, for a moment, I want to say to you, this is pretty serious decision on Judah's part, because he has effectively put her in a legal limbo. She has no ability to move on, as we would say, with her life, to marry someone else, to have a family, have children. She's just placed from one particular kind of authority into the other, and this is a complete constraint of her movements of her future. In the context of Hebrew Bible, which entirely speaks to the value of women related to their ability to have children, she is effectively at a complete dead end with her life, right? You actually achieve your status, as Sarah says, you know, she gives Abraham at that point, Hagar, so that she will be built up through Hagar, because the idea is that Hagar will have a child Sarah can claim as her own, can adopt, right? So it's not enough to be Abraham's wife. Sarah has to have a child in order for her to, you know, have the status that is accorded a woman in Hebrew Bible. So this is a pretty serious decision Judah makes, to leave Tamar in limbo and not just marry Shelah to somebody else, right? Okay, now the sheep shearings that Pidge talked about, right? And what I want to tell you about is, I alluded to this last week, that sheep shearing celebrations feature both feasting and heavy drinking. It's generally a time to have fun, to do a little boundary breaking, to play tricks. You could even plot murder. If you think of the sheep shearings, what happens? At one sheep shearing, Jacob surreptitiously escapes from Laban. That's in Genesis 31. In another sheep shearing, David acquires a new wife, that's Abigail, from a very foolish husband who is inclined to very heavy drinking. There's a lot of food and interesting sexual language in that whole chapter in 1 Samuel 25. Tamar disguises her, as we know in this story, to induce her father-in-law to have sex with her and impregnate her. And Absalom deceptively invites his brother Amnon to festivities at a sheep shearing, where he arranges to get him drunk and then killed. So we've got a lot of associations in the narrative text. And as Hosea writes, you know, he's associating these kinds of sacrifices with sexuality, and particularly the idea of fornicating on threshing holes, right, to obtain abundant harvests in the ancient Near East, and even actually in fairly recent celebrations. Like, just think of what you know about May Day, right? What traditionally would happen at May Day: a lot of partner sharing and a lot of dancing and a lot of drinking, and even things like spilling seed on the field in order to evoke fertility, all that kind of thing. This is part and parcel of that kind of ancient practice and ancient marking of fertility festivals. So, okay, what's the transaction? So now we're into the material, we're starting to get into the material that we ended with I used a euphemism in the second one because I'm kind of a prude and I don't really like to use certain words, but you will get the idea. Judah first cites a woman again, apparently in Hira's company. Again, he turns to Tamar like he turns to Hira. And Judah commands Tamar in pretty explicit Hebrew. So again, you might get something like he asks, well, what will you give me? What will you need from me in order for me to sleep with you? But the Hebrew is actually quite graphic. It uses a paragogic hey, which won't mean anything to any of you, but it's really forceful language. This is actually a more appropriate translation than the ones you probably have. He promises her a kid. This is the fleecing moment pitch. And she says, well, yeah, maybe you'll send it to me, but first you better give me a pledge of some sort so that I can be sure that I'm going to get this. And what we have here, what I'm trying to argue is that we have turning towards Hira creates a kind of homosocial intimacy, and sexuality and sex follows with a woman. And the narrative makes clear that this turning to is again going to strengthen a relationship between two men, that these two men are both involved in what is now going to follow. Okay, let me just actually stop and say, are there any questions? Because now I'm going to get into some new material that we didn't do last week. So any questions about this so far? Okay, doesn't look like it. So when I say she demands the ancient equivalent to his social security card, and he's in effect handing her his manhood and his identity, a seal is a really important, vital marker of your personal identity. Some of you may know that particularly in certain Asian countries, when I lived in Kaohsiung, everything I had to sign, included a stamp of a seal with my name on it. In the ancient world, seals are understood as among the most precious items you can have. We actually have in various museums some of these ancient seals. They're so important, they're so vital as a marker of your identity and position that they might actually be donated to gods or given as a special gift to followers. So for Judah to give away his seal is kind of like giving away his social security card or, his credit card. Another scholar describes it like that. He's giving Tamar his credit card to use. And she also demands his staff and his cord. And the word staff here is actually the word mateh is an object of authority. Again, can indicate like a scepter and can indicate a staff with even magical properties. Maybe you remember that there's a point in the book of Numbers where Moses has a test of authority between Aaron and the followers of Korah. And he says, everybody bring their staffs, and he puts them in the tabernacle. And Aaron's is the one that flowers, bursts into flower, demonstrating power, majesty, and fertility all in one moment, right? And those sexual associations are actually quite unavoidable because the word staff is also a euphemism for the male member in Hebrew Bible. There's a whole text in the chapter I wrote on this book that kind of quotes another ancient text in making how clear this is. That association is therefore sort of native for the ancient biblical reader, that you would have phallic associations associated with the staff. So in a way, what Tamar has asked Judah to give her is his identity and a symbol of his manhood. So you want to think about how the extent to which he's getting fleeced, you might really want to think about that, right? So what have we got here? What's the scene? We had two men headed for a raucous celebration with other men and celebrating the fertility of, either crops or animal life. They're traveling together and they have to have seen Tamar at the same time. And so, one thing we never ask is, where was Hira during these negotiations? Like, did he walk on? Did he wait for Judah to pay for the prostitute he thought he was encountering and to join him? Did he somehow observe what was going on? He certainly knows about the bargain they strike, because later he's going to play a pivotal role in trying to redeem these pledges. So I really want us to think about this issue of, what do both men know about this whole transaction? And again, I suggest you read the Charlotte Observer article and ask yourself the same question, like, who knows what? And who is in league, or at least complicit, or participating in what, right? And how often do we see a sexual experience with a woman, whether consensual or not, arranged and facilitated not simply by one man? And I've spent a lot of time researching what happens in contexts where men are actually working together in some way in order to facilitate the use of a woman's body. I'm not going to give you lots of examples from sociological studies that I've read, but is this a phenomenon in a hegemonic male structure? It is. So, all right, Judah sends off this kid to by his friend, and it's quite explicit that Hira is his friend. And Hira runs around asking the locals for help, and he asks, where's the Kadesha, right? So what is he doing, and why does he use that word? There is actually a cover-up going on. It is interesting how many translations basically translate the word Kadesha as temple prostitute. Literally, it just means a holy one, right? From the word kadosh, which means holy. This whole context of it being a temple prostitute, we can thank Greek readers for, because there was a whole Greek historians who did a number on trying to smear ancient Near Eastern cultures by claiming that they engaged in temple prostitution. There is actually no evidence outside of these Greek writers' claims that specifically indicates that temple prostitution was a practice in ancient Israel. We have no evidence of that in ancient Israel or even Canaan. So that's kind of a smear tactic that's been used for centuries, which may have nothing to do with actual historical evidence. A really wonderful historian and scholar, John Westenholz, has looked at this term in its use in not only Hebrew Bible, but in Akkadian sources and Ugaritic sources. These are all language sources of the ancient Near East. And when this term comes up, it looks like this is a woman who may have had one or two associations, either that she's a midwife, that she functions to help women basically give birth, or she might have been a cultic leader involved in certain kinds of purification rituals, often associated with water. And so therefore, she might have been a functionary who would have accepted a donation from the people in that area. So quite possibly, what Hira is doing here is giving the impression to the locals that he has a sacrifice to offer a woman who is foreign in that territory and who has been seen, and he's using the word Kadesha, right, in order to cover up his actions, which are really about getting back Judah's stuff from a woman he expects is actually a prostitute. So I'm hoping everybody's following this. There's kind of a little bit of covering up here, and those of us who remember the last 5 years and the extent to which certain men were busily covering up for other men should find this kind of thing somewhat familiar. So what is a good friend, right? What makes a good friend? It's Hira, I would argue, who Judah sends to help cover up his less than licit doings. It's Hira he trusts to investigate, to complete the transaction, to act as Judah's fixer. It's Hira who acts to protect the non-disclosure agreement that Judah has had with Tamar. And their relationship is very close, quite intimate, and strengthened by this shared experience. They are working together to protect Judah's reputation, but not only Judah's reputation. There is an issue here, excuse me, let me go back a little bit about this, and then say something a little bit more here. The "lest we become a laughingstock" verse is a verse that has been almost universally passed over by scholars in the field. If there is one fundamentally new thing I say about this text, it hinges on the fact that people are not noticing that Judah doesn't say to Hira, look, let it go, don't worry about it, you didn't find her, don't do anything more lest I become a laughingstock. He says, lest we become a laughingstock. And that to me is interesting, right? He himself knows, the author himself knows, that both of these men are somehow involved in this. It's both their reputations on the line. And remember that both of these men are big dudes in this area. If Judah has made enough money to sire 3 children, to find a wife, on his own, to have his own sheep shearers working for him, he's doing pretty well. If Hira is important enough to be able to go to the townspeople and say, oh, by the way, I'm looking for somebody, and be answered, he has a kind of authority in this world. So lest we become a laughingstock is actually indicating how close that relationship is. The author could have had Judah say, don't do anything, I don't want to be a laughingstock, right? Those pronouns are not, immaterial. Okay, so now into the sunset, right? Well, you've got 2 men who've had fun. One man clearly had that fun. The other apparently is okay with what happened and is willing to handle the outcome. A woman is actually threatened with being burned alive for the sake of male honor. That's Judah's honor. And we want to think about the fact that had no one agreed to bring her message to Judah, right, she would have been burned alive, right? Judah had ordered that she be burned alive. And again, the very fact that he could order such a thing and be listened to is actually pretty important. She is taken out of her father's house, and for the express purpose of being burned alive. Now, is it likely that when she handed the seal to somebody, they recognized Judah, that it was Judah's seal? Maybe. It's something to think about. Certainly at the end, her entire purpose is to have produced the lineage. She's invoked twice more, and only in the context of producing Judah's sons. In other words, her importance is in the fact that she was the woman who carried the lineage forward. So this quote, which I gave you last week in a slightly longer form, is going to be the point that I'm trying to make both last week, this week, and next week, that we do get highly sexually interesting narratives and sexualized scenes presented for an audience, which in the ancient world would have been a male audience, male writers were writing for a male audience, and that these male characters do bond over sexual experience. I didn't, this is something I write about in the book a lot, that people miss, that when Amnon has this arranged situation for his sister to be brought to him, there's a host of men in the room that observe what happens, and looking at when he throws them out and where they might be and how quickly they are available to throw her out after he has raped her is important for us to notice, right? This is not just happening in some solitary world, right? Hegemonic masculinity, I also told you last week, is depending on practicing gender, so that you can secure male entitlement and male hierarchy, and that sharing the female body is really the raw material for the friendships that are generated and that we can see operating in Hebrew Bible. Okay, that was a lot of stuff. time for some questions. I also want to say to you that, I know this is hard. I mean, these are my sacred texts too, people, right? And recognizing the difficulties that they can present to us when we have generally been given, quite often, an interpretation of both characters and narratives that puts those characters and narratives in the best possible light, right? Even the translations do that work for us. It makes it harder to do this kind of work where we get into the weeds and find out what's actually happening in the Hebrew text and what does it say to us about the culture that produced these texts. And I can promise you that you can do exactly the same kinds of things with New Testament texts as well, because some of the things that are features that I'm describing are being worked on by scholars of New Testament in those settings as well. So we have a shared corpus of texts that feature elements that are challenging for us to observe and challenging for us to analyze. That said, some reactions, some thoughts, some questions. It's your turn to do the talking and my turn to do the listening. Okay, looks like Jane is ready to go. Go, Jane. You'll have to unmute, Jane, because I'd love to hear you. There's a little mute button at the bottom left of your screen, should be, that you can click on to unmute. And if she's having trouble, Megan, can you do that for her?
I'm
All right,
looking
we'll
to
have Megan.
see.
There you go.
There we go.
Jane,
There we go.
you are now no longer voiceless.
In the very beginning, I thought he broke the law or the tradition by not allowing his third son to marry Tamar. And that put her in a very bad position in having to con him into what he did so that she would have a child. He broke the law to start with.
That is exactly correct. Now, you could claim, he tries to cover it up, right? He says, well, Shelah isn't old enough, right? So he's trying to do a little cover up on his own action. But the fact that time passes and, the text tells us time passes and then his wife dies, suggests to the reader or the listener that, yeah, he's dithering, right? He could have brought her back and then completed the levirate. Now, he also does something kind of sneaky here, which is sort of describing her as the killer wife, right? I'm not going to give my son to her lest something happen to him. And the irony is that we as readers know it has nothing to do with Tamar, and that Tamar's body is being used by one, of Judah's sons after the other, particularly the second one, in a truly ugly way, right? And that it's there. The problem is with them, not with her. But he's the one who blames her, which actually is an interesting moment for us to see that the biblical author is actually giving us a sympathetic portrayal in some respects of Tamar. Yeah.
And it's fairly clear that God is mad with the first two sons, evidently for different reasons, and sort of God's doing the killing for actions they have committed, but she gets blamed for it.
Yes, that's a really good point, Mary, because one of the things that I'm not willing to let the deity off the hook here, right? If the deity, behaved appropriately, shall we say, why let Onan repeatedly use Tamar's body to do this business with spilling seed repeatedly before the deity says, oh, okay, well, all right, he's not going to work out. Maybe it should be Shelah. This is the same deity, by the way, who after, depending on how you count it, either 230 years or 400 years says, oh, I've heard the cry of my people and they are enslaved and maybe I should go back and do something about it. So, it's not a deity who necessarily is going to immediately act in a way that we would hope for, right? If he really was interested in protecting Tamar. And yes, Tamar gets blamed for it and she practically gets burned.
That's a weird activity on God's part in terms of how much grace he's giving in that situation. I'm gonna give you many opportunities here.
Yes, Yes, Rick, I think that is very worth pointing out, and it will come to bear on the text that we're going to look at next week, which will feature all sorts of interesting behavior on the part of the deity in relationship to Abraham, and what Abraham does with his wife Sarah, and Isaac does with his wife Rebecca. So absolutely. Yes, good point. Okay, other comments and thoughts? Leah.
Considering how women were treated, I am surprised that he gave her his Social Security card, that he had to do anything.
Yep. It's interesting how, in a way, there's a bit of burlesque here, Leah. And this is another thing that we don't know much about Hebrew Bible, how often there's burlesque and humor going on. Sort of the implication post-coitus or pre-coitus, he's too driven by his need to have a brain in his head, and he gives away stupid stuff because he wants to do what he wants to do, right? Something
was smart enough to ask for that. That was her get out of burning free card.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, she's protecting herself, but the fact that he is so driven by his sexual need to just hand over those kinds of things is interesting, right? And while I didn't say it to you earlier, the text does not tell us where Hira is located. Does he overhear? Does he observe? Is he present? Is he not? I mean, we don't know. We do know that he knows what happened, and he knows intimately what happened. Pam.
Can you talk more about the role of women in that society? So it was to bear children, but what else were they doing? Were they honored in any way? Were they in charge of taking care of the family? Were they protectors? Can you just talk about that?
So there are two different settings in which I could talk about that. One would be the setting of the Hebrew Bible, which frankly is written by what William Dever calls, it's a minority report. It's written by male elites for a male audience. We know that there's all sorts of reasons that we know that, not the least of which is the phrase that frequently is translated as people of Israel is actually referring to the men of Israel, right? And the amount of sexual display and frankly titillating that's done for a male audience is much more present in these texts than you might imagine. So what happens for women in these texts? So first of all, it's complicated always to make a blanket statement about a corpus that is written and composed and rewritten and edited over a period of about 800 to 1,000 years, right? Different writers, different geographies, different times, different agendas, that becomes problematic. So on the one hand, are there, the last chapter in my book actually doesn't feature men, it features two women. Because I ask the question, can women be friends? And can women be friends in a way that they use men's bodies, right? Can we flip the script? And so I basically ask, what happens with Yael and Devorah, right? And the killing of Sisera, because so many people have described the killing of Sisera as a kind of a reverse rape, right? What's going on there, right? Do we see something, the phenomena that's the same? I conclude, no, it's not the same phenomena. They're never described as friends. They don't collude. They don't work together. There's all sorts of things that suggest that something else is important in that text around their position. And what I argue, Pam, is that their position is really predominantly that of being mothers, right? And that the text emphasizes that women as mothers, that is their most critical role in just about any of these texts. Now, does that mean that women never have agency? I would say no. Also, I would argue that in Hebrew Bible, there is no single text that ever describes women openly as inferior to men. There is a text that defines them as subordinate to men, and many depictions in which they are subordinate to men, but it never describes them as inferior to men. I want to say that that's a critical piece. Some scholars argue that we do see, because of the influence of Greek ideas, the description of women in New Testament texts as genuinely inferior, right? That men are the crown and that women are not just subordinate, but they are inferior to men in how they think and how they can pray and how they can deliver the word, in all of those things. Now, whether that's the case or not, I will leave to the scholars of New Testament, of which I am not. So we do have characters like the Shulamite, who, is independently wealthy and tells her husband to blow off when she's having to save her child, and to make sure that Elisha comes and does the saving of her child. And she does all that on her own, right? Now, she still has to navigate a world of men and male power, but it's significant, that story. I think we should take a look at that, right? And the way that Abigail basically navigates the whole system she's in, who she's married to and who she needs to be married to, and how she's going to get into a safer position. It's pretty clever what she does. She totally appeals to David's most base instincts and succeeds, because David is not a nice guy. That's my next book, by the way. So
Thank you.
yeah, sure. Pam, you want a longer conversation about this? We could, there's a lot to say. Yeah. Okay, other questions? Either from our YouTube group or all of you? I love the questions and comments you're giving me. They're great.
Barbara, this is Emmy.
Yeah.
But the examples you've just given, it seems to me, are still saying that the power lies in the hands of the males of the society.
Yep.
And that women, not having economic and political power, had to leverage what they did have. And that was the sexual attraction, the sexual pleasure they provided men, the ability to provide males with immortality through heirs, and therefore to use all of that to both, get their needs met, or even just to survive, and perhaps to help their children survive, was cleverness, manipulation, because they didn't have other means to achieve those ends. Is that not what you're seeing in those stories as well?
Yes, I would say absolutely yes. But the fact that they can be clever, right? The fact that every now and again we get a moment where, for example, the deity says, you better listen to Sarah. She's the one whose, voice counts here, right? These rare moments do not give, you can't, Emma, you cannot have agency in a world of hegemonic masculinity that is not, if you are a woman, constrained by the rules of hegemonic masculinity. And this is a world that, as you quite rightfully point out, and as I argue throughout my book, is completely structured around male power, male rank, male initiative, and male needs. And that includes the deity's needs. And the deity is quite a character in the deity's own right. The deity can change his mind. The deity hands women from one man to another. Go back and look at 2 Samuel 12, and you'll see Nathan explicitly saying, I gave your master's women to you, to Nathan, right? That the deity says this, I gave your master's women to you, i.e. Saul's women to you, and I can give your women to another man. And he does it, right? Absalom does, as I said last week, rape all 10 of David's concubines on the very roof, likely, from which David was ogling Bathsheba. So yes, you're absolutely right on and dead on here. And the only mitigating factor you can find is that there are these little moments where women do have agency within this structure that allows them, as Tamar did, to be the initiator of action. Now, in the end, what does it serve her? I mean, she produces those men and she's lost from the story. Judah goes on to have a whole story and all of his heirs, it's about his heirs, right? So yeah, I'm trying to figure out the best possible piece here that I can give you so that it doesn't end up being entirely depressing. But if I'm honest, if you were to read the book, the very conclusion that I come to is that Hebrew Bible is actually toxic for women.
Barbara?
To that point, we actually have a question coming from YouTube. Julia Pepper is asking, Barbara, how do you think the story would appear if Tamar was telling it?
So the name was Julia. Is that right?
Yeah, it's Julia Pepper.
Julia. So Julia, one of the things that I frequently do in teaching these texts, particularly in my seminary, is that I ask the students to write letters from the characters sometimes about how they would tell the story, about their experience, you know, all of this kind of thing is an exercise that helps us access the stories that are not told, the stories that are not given to us. From Tamar's perspective, it would be very difficult for me not to retroject here my own needs, right? And not have a Tamar saying all the reasons why what happens to her is wrong, all the reasons why what she does is forced upon her, all the reasons why her difficult birth of twins and then being forgotten as anything other than the womb that bore the lineage of David. I'd have a probably pretty pissed off Tamar because I'm pissed off about it. That would probably be what would happen. And there might be some of you who would write a Tamar who is grieving, like one loss after another. You know, is she grieving hopes that she had? Yeah. Jane,
What happened to the two sons that she bore?
Well, one of them becomes the progenitor of the line that produces David, right? And rather interestingly, there are echoes of Tamar's story in the book of Ruth, where Ruth too ends up going out in the middle of the night at Naomi's direction in order to meet with a man, right? And it is Ruth who then, you know, I mean, this is just I often teach this particular narrative around the stories of immigrants, immigrant voice, the structures that keep immigrants having to negotiate the structures that they are in of power. And Ruth is the one who negotiates effectively the marriage with Boaz in the middle of the night. And what happens in the middle of the night is, you know, a pretty sexualized scene. And again, on a threshing floor. So yeah, we've got another moment, Emmy, of women effectively having to use their bodies in order to make themselves safe.
Barbara, it's Pidge.
Okay, Pidge and then Rick. I think I saw Rick. Okay. Go Pidge.
Well, maybe from a woman's perspective, I'm sitting here and all this sex with all these women, there had to be pregnancies.
Mm-hmm.
What do we have any indication of what would have happened to the children of all this activity?
Well, first, a rather sad reality from the archaeological record is that around the time of, say, between 12th and 10th century BCE, this is another thing I frequently want people to think about. The archaeological record shows us that women lived to the average age of 30 and men to the age of 40. And the archaeological record also shows us that in order to raise 2 children to adulthood, you probably would have had to have 4 children, because half of the children that are born die. A goodly number before the age of 5, and the rest often before they reach 18, which is why Carol Myers says, especially if you look specifically at the Hebrew of Genesis 3:17, it does not say that she's cursed with labor pains. It really doesn't. This is a terrible translation. And it's been like repeated for centuries. And first of all, she isn't cursed at all, but God says this will be the consequence of your action. And the literal Hebrew reads, you are going to have multiple pregnancies, and that's going to be very wearing and toilsome and hard. And Carol Myers thinks that that's actually reflecting the real truth of the time, which is that there are going to be multiple pregnancies that are going to take a toll on her body, and that all of this is going to be really, really hard for her. And the corollary is that Adam is going to have to work the land, which is going to be really, really unwilling to yield its fruit. Also hard work, right? So what happens with all the sex and all the children that might have happened in ancient Israel? Unfortunately, that's all I can tell you from the archaeological record. The biblical record, does report when people get pregnant and what happens to the children. But in that larger structural sense, the basic premise is that a woman's sexuality belongs first to her father, who literally owns it. And that sexuality is then transferred to her husband, i.e., the right to her body. And then her husband owns it. This is why if you sleep with a woman who belongs to another man, i.e. a father, right, not betrothed to you, still her father, or she's married, you're committing adultery. But if you sleep with a woman who is a prostitute, you're fine, no problems, even if you're already married. There's a very interesting double standard that goes on here. Yeah. Okay, Rick, you had something.
Yeah, just to touch a little bit on, the toxicity of these kinds of stories. Yeah. I find it interesting, to think in terms of not just the reading of this story, but the telling of this story over the course of time. Even the telling of the story, even in mixed company like this, or to expand it out, think about situations where a story is being told like in a play where there's an audience, a mixed audience watching a scene. What comes to my mind is like that, the Fez or Shriner scene in Bye Bye Birdie. I don't know if any of you remember that musical or not, but there's a very uncomfortable scene in the middle of that play that is shoved on the audience, but nobody gets to talk with each other about it, while you're watching it. And at least for me, being a man in that audience, it was extremely uncomfortable seeing that. And I kind of, I don't want us to go down a rabbit hole here too much, but I think in terms of the social media and what we've seen in recent behavior by politicians and how public that is, and how toxic is the nature of what we see, what we hear, what we are allowed to talk about, what we don't talk about. Mm-hmm. To me, there's many layers of looking back at what this story has in store for itself, but also what's the ongoing impact of that story as it's being retold and potentially relived.
I can't tell you how much that is, how much that resonates for me, because as a religious leader, seeing the ways that stories are told, the ways in which 2,000 years of cover-up have been performed on these sacred texts, the ways in which they have become sanitized or told in ways that actually will blame the women. I may have mentioned the way Martin Luther describes the story of Dinah. He basically blames her and says, "Oh, woe for Jacob for having a recalcitrant, stubborn daughter who walked out on her own to make friends with girls of the neighborhood. Poor Jacob." Like that's his treatment of this. And that's the kind of thing that made its way into sermons for hundreds and hundreds of years. To the second point, which I think is also vital to my own agendas for the rest of my own life, what is it that we feel free and feel safe talking about? It is still so difficult for anyone who has been the victim of sexual harassment or sexual violence to speak about that. It is difficult and almost never done, that I know of, for men to come forward and speak about their experience with sexual harassment or sexual violence. Though many years ago, I did have one student come to me while I was teaching a course that included texts of terror, and he told me he had to stay out of the classroom for a couple of weeks because he was being triggered, because he had been the victim of sexual abuse as a child. And there is no venue that I know of that really, or few venues that I know of, that offer permission for men to get together, particularly heterosexual men, to talk about the structures in which they were educated and the structures to which they may feel now that they were complicit or at least passive bystanders to. And that is particularly the case for my own generation of men, right? I mean, where has there been a way for men to process the kind of learning that I hope the Me Too movement is offering them, or the kind of learning that they must have experienced when there was a woman in their life who experienced sexual harassment or sexual assault, or whether they just suddenly, right, realized maybe things that they had understood that were wrongly understood about permissible behavior, all of those things, right? Where is the place for that? Where's the space for that? I think Rick is pointing to a terrific need.
And, you know, to make a parallel, you know, it reminds me of a friend of my wife's that, you know, my age. And one time we were together, and he was raised Catholic, and actually was like an altar boy in a Catholic church, and actually would be sleeping in the seminary area there with the priests. And, you know, like there are many stories we know about now, you know, there was one priest that was particularly fond of the boys. And he was faced, you know, with the fact, you know, he would be drawn into a situation where he would have to protect himself by victimizing another boy. The priest would come in and tap him on the shoulder and say, I need you to come into this room and see me and talk about something. He would go wake up another boy and say, oh, Father so-and-so wants to see you in this room. You know, that's the kind of toxicity that people experience, but don't get the chance to talk about. Number one, because it's so toxic and so damaging to even retell. But it happens. And, you know, where does a guy like him have a venue?
Where does he go? Yes,
yeah.
Right.
You know.
So because we have just a couple minutes to wrap up, I want to do two things. First, I want to say that you have the opportunity, the choice to ask yourselves what is available to you, men and women, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, transsexual, right? What is available? And what do you need? I would actually advocate for some conversations with your spiritual leaders about these very questions. And then I would also say to you, I know this is hard, and I know that this is triggering, and probably for just about everybody in the room for different reasons. And nevertheless, the work that we do here can make us compassionate, clear, and forceful in what we need to say and what we need to do in order to protect real human beings, in order to create a world in which there is no girl who is not safe. There is no boy who is not safe. There is no man, no woman, no any person who is not safe from the misuse of their mind, their heart, their body, and their soul. To that end, we're going to look at the deity's role in all of this. So if you could look at the following texts before next week, Genesis 12, Genesis 20, and Genesis 26, we're going to take a look at the sister-wife stories. That's what they're often described. The stories where our patriarchs say, oh, she's my sister. And then there's some pretty frightening things that happen to their wives. Thank you all so much for your kindness, for your receptivity, for your willingness to go down this path with me. You are a wonderful, wonderful and refreshing place for me to land every single spring, and I appreciate it.
I have one question.
Thank you.
Take care. I'll stay on in case there's any last question for anyone.
Thanks,
Bob.